Rabbi Alfred Gottschalk of blessed memory was the president of the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion, which on its 4 campuses trains Reform rabbis, cantors, Jewish educators, communal workers, and scholars. Dr. Gottschalk would tell this story at this time of year, his own memory of the day after Kristallnacht. As a child, Alfred Gottschalk lived in Oberwessel, Germany, and on November 10th, 1938, the day after the night of broken glass, he went with his grandfather to the river. And he watched his grandfather, a dignified man, wade into the cold water to rescue the ripped remnants of a Torah scroll that had been thrown into the river the night before. And his grandfather took up these torn pieces in his arms, and he brought them back to shore, and he put them into his grandson's arms and said, "One day, together we will put them back together." Dr. Gottschalk devoted his whole life to Hebrew Union College in order to fulfill that mission, that promise to put the pieces of the torn Torah scroll back together again. And it seems that some centuries, some decades, some generations, as they come and go, we are asking again, how do we restore those broken pieces, those shattered pieces? How do we put it back together again? And that's what we see in our Torah reading. We heard how Isaac had to dig up again the wells of his father, because while he was living in the land of the Philistines, they blocked them up. They covered them up with rubble. Out of revenge, out of jealousy for how Isaac was flourishing in their land. And so he called each well by a name. This one he called Wrangle, because the people wrangled against him. And this one he called Animosity, because he knew how they felt about him. And another one, when the quarreling stopped, when the quiet came, when the solidarity and unity and respect came, he named that well Rechovot, meaning now, finally, God has granted us ample room, and together we can make this land fruitful. And that night, God appeared to Isaac, saying, "I am the God of your father Abraham. Al tira, do not be afraid, for I am with you. I will bless you, and I will make your descendants numerous for the sake of my servant Abraham." And so Isaac built an altar at that place, and he called upon the name of God there. And he pitched his tent, and he dug one more well. The Torah can be rewritten on parchment and stitched back together again. A shattered stained glass window can be fused together again with heat and molten lead. Jewish books set to fire can be reprinted. Synagogues set to fire can be restored and rebuilt. Jewish schools as well. Things that are broken are only things and can be restored. But the memories of the break, those do not fade. The sound of the shattering reverberates through the generations. The pain might soften to an ache, but it remains, even 80 years later. This week, Chancellor Angela Merkel attended a ceremony at the Reichsstrasse Synagogue of Berlin to commemorate 80 years since Kristallnacht. The head of the German Jewish Community Council, Josef Schuster, retold the story of that particular synagogue and how it was set alight on Kristallnacht in 1938, and how it survived because the neighbors' houses were so close that people were afraid the fire would spread. So it wasn't out of concern for the synagogue, but out of concern for the neighbors. And Schuster said that while the Nazis were responsible for that pogrom, it meant that thousands of Germans took part. The population's reaction gave the Nazis valuable information. Barely anyone protested. So Merkel then, in response, made a pledge. She said, "We are commemorating today with the promise that we will firmly set ourselves against attacks on today's open and pluralistic society." And what about right here? Another significant moment here. Prime Minister Trudeau's apology for Canada's turning away the ship called the St. Louis in 1939. It helps. That apology was planned months ago, but we need it now. After the recent attack at the Tree of Life congregation, Prime Minister Trudeau's words were given and received as sincere comfort for a people in mourning. In Judaism, apologies matter. I know there are some who are cynical and say this was just political posturing. But in Jewish life, spoken apologies are an essential step in the process of teshuvah, of repentance and change. Admitting wrongdoing, naming the facts of the transgressions, accepting responsibility for them, for any harm, and seeking forgiveness from those who suffered even 80 years later. These are all very real acts of turning toward the good. The Prime Minister's stance on refugees today is evidence that lessons have been learned from the St. Louis. That stain on Canada's history should forever guide this country's conscience and how it makes Rehovot, how it makes a wide expanse, makes room for human beings who are running for their lives. Just as Canadian Jews today are grateful and loyal and contributing citizens for how we have found safety and safe haven in this good country, so are the many other circles of refugees who have come from the four corners of the earth with nothing but their hopes for a better life for themselves and for their children. The Prime Minister described how the world's humanity was tested then, and how Canada, among so many others, failed that test then. He said, "In the years leading up to the war, Hitler tested the world's resolve. He noted carefully as country after country proved itself indifferent to the plight of Jewish refugees. He watched on as we refused their visas, ignored their letters, and denied them entry. With every decree, he challenged the political courage of our leaders and the empathy of those who elected them. With every pogrom, he tested the bounds of our humanity and the limits of our solidarity. Hitler's test was one that the Canadian government failed miserably. We used our laws to mask our anti-Semitism. We let anti-Semitism take hold in our communities and eventually become our official policy. Your country failed you, and for that we are sorry." It seems some dark corners of the world are testing once again. And so the Prime Minister's articulated apology is more than an apology, and we should express our gratitude for it. He acknowledged the growing anti-Semitism today, and he pledged to fight it in all its forms. In the presence of Parliament and in the presence of the one remaining Canadian survivor of the St. Louis, and in the presence of many Holocaust survivors, he said, "Sadly, these evils did not end with the Second World War. Canada and all Canadians must stand up against xenophobia and anti-Semitic attitudes that still exist in our communities, in our schools, and in our places of work. Following the recent horrific attack in Pittsburgh, Jewish Canadians are understandably feeling vulnerable, he said. We know that here in Canada we are not immune to hate crimes grounded in anti-Semitism. Our government and members of parliament are working with the Jewish community to better protect against the threat of anti-Semitism. Places of worship are sacred, and they should be sanctuaries for all our faith communities. This place of worship, this sacred sanctuary, was where we took sanctuary last Shabbat. And members of the government and members of the community of all faiths joined us both inside the sanctuary and outside the sanctuary to make a ring of protection, a ring of peace, so that we might feel more confident in our prayers inside. I want to note that this year, the Shabbat, just before Remembrance Day, is the first time that we don't have any of our veterans from World War II taking to the Bima. Every year I watched again and again how they would come with this aliyah. I see a lot of heads shaking, wearing their medals and standing proud, and even in walkers and wheelchairs, they stood so tall. And now they are frail and aged, and it is our responsibility to care for them. Even though they are not present on the Bima today, they're represented by you, Andrew Zalvin. And we hold them in our prayers today. We ask that God will continue to bless them with strength of body and strength of spirit. Tomorrow will mark 100 years since Armistice Day. At the end of our service today, we will recall the names of the young men of Holy Blossom Temple who fell in World War I and in World War II. How they and those who served and survived put their lives on the line in the fight against tyranny. That is what we honor this day. They did so as proud Canadians. They did so as proud Jews. They did so as descendants of Isaac. Perhaps in the dark foxholes and in the muddy trenches, they heard echoes of God's promise to Isaac, saying, Al Tira, do not be afraid, for I am with you. I will bless you, and I will make your descendants numerous. Who are their descendants? We are. And who builds up an altar today? We do. And who redigs the wells so that the life-giving waters beneath can emerge? We do. We are their direct descendants, and a measure of their courage is part of our inheritance. This Shabbat we remember them and we pledge to carry on their good names. We too will shout out hatred in all of its forms, wherever and whenever we hear it or see it. We too will fight anti-Semitism when it rears its ugly head, both in scary and in subtle ways. We too will be on the lookout for when nationalistic pride slips into fascist undertones or even overtones. How do we put the pieces of that torn Torah scroll back together again? Just like this. By gathering in our sanctuary, by calling up a bat mitzvah to the Torah, with parents and grandparents at her side to bless the Torah, by coming together joyfully on Shabbat after Shabbat, festive days after festive days, by building up a beautiful new space to expand, to find Rehovot, a wide open space. Our atrium just on the other side of this wall represents the ambitions we have for the Jewish future, represents a pledge to the coming generations that we anticipate, that we guarantee a good Jewish life for them here in Canada. and by demonstrating to the greatest generation that their sacrifices were not made in vain. Ushmor tzeitenu uvo'enu, v'chayimu l'shalom me'ata ve'ad olam. Guardian of our people, watch over us as we come and go. Give us life and peace now and forever. Amen.